happening in America right now, and people can feel it, even if they don't have words for it yet. Churches are quieter, questions are louder, and faith feels different than it did 10, 20, 30 years ago. Tonight is not about attacking religion, it's not about defending institutions, and it's definitely not about telling anyone what to believe. Tonight is about understanding a shift, a spiritual shift that is already underway. Because something strange is happening. People aren't rejecting God the way headlines suggest. They're rejecting the version of God they were handed, and that difference matters more than most realize. If you're here tonight, chances are you're Steve. Maybe you don't know anymore, believe in something, but you're not sure it fits anywhere. And that can be weakness. It's a signal. Faith in America followed a familiar. You were born into it, inherited it. You stayed even when you doubted, because leaving in community, identity, sometimes family. But the gravitational pull is weakening. Not because people suddenly became evil or rebellious, not because morality vanished overnight, but because something quietly broke. Trust. Trust in leaders, trust in institutions, trust in narratives that no longer match. And once trust erodes, belief. Few were willing to say out loud. A lot of people didn't leave lost faith. They left because they cared too much to fake it. Reconcile with condemnation. They couldn't reconcile love with fear. They couldn't reconcile felt cold or transactional. So they walked away. Not always from God building. When people leave structures, they don't stop searching. They search harder. The humaning, it reroutes. And right now, across America, others are calling it apostasy. But history tells a different story. Every time faith becomes rigid, something breaks. And every time something breaks, something deeper tries to emerge. This isn't the first spiritual country, it's one we're living through. In the past, awakenings didn't begin in sanctuaries. They began in questions, uncomfortable questions, dangerous questions. Questions institutions couldn't fully answer. Questions like, why does faith feel more like pressure than peace? Why do sermons sound confident but people feel empty? Why does God feel closer in silence than in noise? These aren't signs of disbelief. They're signs of between inner truth and outer systems, and friction always leads to calling isn't the enemy. Certainty without reflection matters. It matters enough to wrestle with. And wrestling has always been part of genuine faith, even if modern religion forgot that. In ancient texts, the heroes weren't the ones who never questioned. They were the ones who argued with God, who demanded answers, who sat in silence and refused shallow comfort. But somewhere along the way, faith became fragile. Questions became threats. Silence became suspicious. And that fragility pushed people away. especially younger generations. Millennials and Gen Z didn't wake up one day and decide faith was outdated. They watched leaders contradict themselves. They watched moral language weaponized. They watched pain dismissed with cliches. And many thought, if this is faith, why does it feel so hollow? So they stepped back, not always angrily, often quietly. No dramatic announcement, just distance. Sunday mornings became time to breathe again. Prayer that began to feel scripted, and then something unsettling happened. God didn't vanish. In fact, for many, God felt closer outside the system than inside it. That's the part no one expected. People began encountering meaning in places religion told them not to look, in nature, in solitude, in long conversations at 2 a.m., in grief, in art, in stillness. And that raised an uncomfortable possibility. What if the institution wasn't the source of faith, but a container that had grown too small? Containers are useful until they crack. And when they crack, what they held doesn't disappear. It spills. Right now, spirituality in America isn't dying. It's leaking out of old forms. That leakage scares institutions, because institutions survive on predictability, but the soul doesn't. The soul moves, the soul adapts, the soul outgrows. And when it does, people feel lost, not because they've lost faith, but because they've lost a map. Most were never taught how to navigate belief without authority, without rules, without someone telling them what a feeling means. So when silence arrives, it feels terrifying. That silence, the one so many are feeling now, deserves attention, because silence is the stage between collapse and rebirth. In spiritual history, silence always comes before transformation. Always. Not answers, not clarity. Silence. And silence exposes what was performative. It strips away borrowed beliefs, inherited language, second-hand certainty. What remains is raw, and raw dangerous, especially to institutions built on order. This is why many leaders are responding with fear, with louder messaging, with more certainty, with sharper boundaries. But volume doesn't fix misalignment. In fact, it often accelerates departure. Because when people are already overwhelmed, shouting doesn't persuade. It confirms their suspicion that something is wrong. A nation full of people who still care about meaning, still care about good and evil, still care about transcendence. But who no longer trust the messengers who claim ownership over God. That's not rebellion, that's grief. Grief for something that once felt alive, grief for community that once felt safe, grief for a faith that once made sense. And grief doesn't resolve quickly. It lingers, it asks questions, it refuses easy answers. Which brings us to the real conflict of this moment. It's not faith versus atheism. It's not belief versus disbelief. It's authentic experience versus institutional certainty. People are choosing experience. They want something lived, not declared, something felt, not enforced, something honest, not polished. And that choice is reshaping the spiritual landscape faster than most realize. Some call it dangerous. Others call it liberation, but history suggests it's neither. It's a transition, and transitions are messy. They produce confusion, contradiction, spiritual hybrids, people who pray but don't attend, people who believe but don't label. People who reject religion but hunger for transcendence. These people don't fit charts. They don't respond to altar calls. They don't speak the language institutions prefer, but they are not empty. They are searching, and searching is sacred, whether institutions approve or not. The question isn't whether the American church is dying. The real question is, what is trying to be born in its place? And before anything new can emerge, something else must be faced. The silence. The silence that arrives when old answers stop working. The silence that makes prayer feel unanswered. The silence that feels like abandonment, but may actually be invitation. That silence is where we go next, because if you understand the silence, you understand this entire moment, and most people misunderstand it completely. There is a moment almost everyone reaches on a spiritual journey that few talk about honestly. It's not the moment of rebellion. It's not the moment of disbelief. It's not even the moment of anger. It's the moment when God goes quiet. Not dramatically silent, not angrily silent, just absent. Prayers feel like they hit the ceiling and fall back down. Scriptures that once comforted feel flat. Worship that once moved you now feels distant, almost artificial. And the most disturbing part isn't the silence itself. It's the confusion it creates. Because silence forces a question we're rarely prepared to ask. If God is real, why does he feel so far away right now? For generations, silence was treated as failure, a lack of faith, a spiritual malfunction. People were taught that if God wasn't responding, it meant they weren't praying hard enough, believing strongly enough, surrendering fully enough. So when silence arrived, shame followed. People smiled in public and panicked in private. They kept attending services while internally unraveling. They memorized language to hide confusion. But silence doesn't mean something is wrong with you. In fact, in spiritual history, silence often means something is about to change. The problem is that institutions rarely prepare people for silence. They prepare people for certainty, for answers, for confidence. But silence dismantles confidence. It strips away formulas. It removes emotional reinforcement. It forces faith to stand without applause, and that's terrifying, because without noise, there's nowhere to hide. Many who leave religion today don't leave because they stopped believing. They leave because the silence became unbearable, and no one helped them understand it. Instead of guidance, they were offered clichés. Just trust. God is testing you. He works in mysterious ways. Those phrases may sound comforting, but in moments of silence, they feel hollow. Because they bypass the pain instead of honoring it. And pain that isn't honored doesn't disappear. It mutates. It turns into resentment, into cynicism, into spiritual numbness. And eventually people conclude that faith itself must be the problem. But silence isn't the absence of God. It's the absence of noise we relied on to feel God. That distinction matters, because much of modern religion confuses emotional stimulation with divine presence. Music crescendos, lighting dims, voices rise. And those experiences can be meaningful, but they're not the foundation of faith, they're the scaffolding. When scaffolding is removed, what remains is structure. And many are discovering that what they thought was faith was actually reinforcement. So when reinforcement disappears, everything feels like it's collapsing. This is where many people are right now. They aren't angry at God. They're exhausted from pretending. They're tired of forcing certainty they no longer feel. Tired of language that doesn't match their inner reality, and silence exposes that gap brutally. But here's the paradox most never hear. Silence is not God withdrawing. Silence is God refusing to be reduced to formulas, reduced to performances, reduced to predictable emotional outcomes. In ancient spiritual traditions, across cultures, silence was expected. It was initiation. Mystics spoke of the dark night. Prophets wandered without instruction. Figures revered today spent years with unanswered prayers, but modern faith markets certainty, and certainty cannot coexist with silence. So when silence arrives, people assume they've failed. What if the opposite is true? What if silence is what happens when borrowed beliefs fall away? What if God goes quiet when faith stops being second-hand? That idea terrifies institutions because it shifts authority inward. It suggests that spiritual growth may require disorientation. And disorientation cannot be controlled. This is why silence is often pathologized. It's labeled depression, backsliding, rebellion. Sometimes those labels are accurate. Often they're not. Often silence is simply the soul recalibrating, letting go of an outdated image of God, letting go of a faith that